You're listening to Breakpoint this week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian perspective. Today, we're going to talk about the upcoming election in the United States. We're also going to talk about a new study about the effect of puberty blockers on kids with gender dysphoria and the way that the study was suppressed in the media. So we have a lot to get to today. We are so glad you're with us. Please stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Bear, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, I voted this week, and I was trying to decide the entire time I was in line at my county board of elections whether this or the TSA was more frustrating. All of the poll workers were very kind and efficient, but just in the terms of like it being a general mass of humanity and all the accompanying diversity of behaviors that one observes in that large of a crowd, I wasn't sure which was worse. And my blood pressure certainly rose while I was in line. But I was encouraged to see that many people.
Well, the correct answer is nothing is worse than the TSA. That's the correct answer. So we know that already. Okay. Now, I think that you're right. It should be encouraging in a sense. I mean, frustrating, sure. It's also notable that, election workers volunteer to do this. They don't do this every single day. In other words, you don't really have this kind of process by which you should learn, better and more efficient ways to handle these masses of people. The TSA does not have that same excuse that election workers would have. That also probably explains the niceness factor. But, we hear this every year. This is the most consequential election in our lifetime. I think it'll be very interesting to see if it indeed seems that way to more Americans. And I think the answer is probably going to be yes, that we're going to see incredible numbers come out. I remember in the first several years that I was able to vote and even into, my 30s, that there was a lot of talk about, can you imagine? Can you believe how many people don't vote? How many people don't care? Those numbers have gone up. Partly because our population has gone up, I guess. But those numbers have gone up, which I think is a good sign. But it also reflects that people feel a political angst that they did not, back in the 1990s and the 2000s and so on, where not everything held the sort of political weight that it does now. And so I go to that phrase. In fact, I wrote in World Opinions this week that that phrase, the most consequential election in our lifetime. I do believe this one is that for us. And I know everyone says it, and then you have a whole group of people who then go roll their eyes and goes, everybody says that every year. But look, it's simple maths. One of them is going to be more consequential than the others, right? I mean, I think that seems inevitable. And I also think that there's so many things that ride on this that it tells you something about the wider and larger cultural realities. Like there are certain things that should be up for a vote. How, for example, to best support families. What shouldn't be up for a vote is whether children belong to the family or children belong to the state, right? Those are pre-political assumed realities that should not be up for debate. And if you're in a cultural reality in which it is, then that says something about that, not just about the vote. Whether all members of the human race are going to be protected. Now, abortion's been on the ballot for a long time, but never like this. Never when in the past, we had this kind of Supreme Court behemoth that predetermined everything. Now we actually have state by state by state, at least in 10 states. Not just whether there's going to be this kind of nebulous idea of abortion rights on there, but specifically without any restrictions, specifically up to the final trimester, specifically for minors without parental notification, in a nation where you can't, give a minor a Tylenol without parental consent in schools, right? Mm-hmm. These are things that shouldn't be on the ballot. And when they are on the ballot, it's true. It's super consequential. On the other hand, it says a lot more. My line, and I, we've used this so many times this year, I don't even know where to begin, but I really think that there's so much this year that is a you are here moment. Like we are having a you are here moment on, what has been called the political illusion, where just too much weight is put on the political process, and it's just not able to hold it up in a sustainable way, for the future. So unless we kind of strengthen the pre-political realities, the extra political realities of our life, this sort of angst and this sort of, you want people to vote, come out to vote because it's their civic duty, not because they feel like the future relies on it. Right. In the sense that it happened. Yeah. Since that it's been this year, I think.
It's kind of a vicious cycle, is like, that's where my head goes when I'm listening to what you're describing, because it's like, these things shouldn't be on the ballot. It shouldn't be up to the government, all of these different questions. And yet they are. So we have to vote in order to get them back off the ballot. You see what I'm saying? Where it's like, and if you don't vote, then they remain. It feels a little bit hopeless, honestly. And, I live in a city. I mean, you do too. And even just seeing, every election in my area, there will be at least, 3 levies. And the language will be dire. Like, if we don't get this money, your libraries will close, your streets will crumble, your schools will fall on top of the students. It's an emergency every time. And you're left feeling like, how did we get in this spot? But also, what do we do about it?
Yeah, because it's not completely inaccurate about the bridges and the streets, right? In terms of the at least in Colorado, you get one bad winter and you've got to redo it all over again anyway.
Yeah, but I guess I'm sitting here like, well, how did you spend the money last time I did this? Because I feel like we voted 6 months ago and I gave you right. But yeah, it's just really hard. It's hard not to feel like it's so consequential, especially too, last night I took my girls around trick-or-treating around the neighborhood, and more like a majority of adults passing out candy had signs in their yard or were wearing T-shirts or hats with candidates' names on it. And I'm thinking like, this is trick or treat for children, but everybody, this has become, I wonder too if it's less, obviously a big part of this election feeling consequential is that it is, like you said, these issues on the ballot are hugely important. I also think since the 90s, there's been like a cultural vibe shift where politics has just become more of a trend, more a part of the way we conceive of ourselves in an identity sense. Like it is an important part of your personality, which party you belong to and who you're going to vote for, more than it used to be. And I do not think that's a positive movement.
Well, that was the line back in the 90s, that identity was becoming tribal. The great philosopher Eminem sang that song, I am whoever you say that I am. And he didn't sing, he kind of rapped it. But the point is that there was this kind of corporate identity, and, it has become highly politicized to the point where, even if at one time it was the tribe was racial or socioeconomic, now if you're not on the political side of the right conversation around a particular race, you actually don't belong to that race. As the sitting president said, in his speech, if you don't vote for me, you're not really black. That was something that, had it been said by a conservative, would have just lit the roof on fire. But beyond that, I actually think that there's a awful lot of people who believe that, who think that way. And it is true that political tribalism now has overtaken some of these other social identities, or it now is the ultimate lens through which these other, quote unquote intersectionalities are evaluated and measured. That's something to note. This is not a small part of our culture right now. This is the critical theory mood. It's also the predictions of the postmodernists, the original theorist who said, if there is no ultimate right and wrong, things devolve into a power struggle. And there is no more obvious way to gain power than political power. And when and I even want to make a distinction of something you said earlier. You said, when all these things are, we don't want the government deciding all this. It's not even the government deciding all this. It's the political process deciding all this. There is a distinction to be made that needs to be made between the political process and governing. And the political process now has even overtaken governing. And so that is, the idea of someone who puts country first. I think there are politicians who believe that and who live that way and who do it and are noble in their professions. I think if you surveyed the average person trick-or-treating last night, are there politicians who put the country first? They would probably say they're popular politician of the moment, and then with a cynical big no, to almost everyone else. That's probably the ethos too. So, the fact that the ascendancy of the political over our cultural lives also sparks this reaction, where everything is kind of this form of a derangement around politics. Either, we talked so often about Jacques Ellul, the quirky French theologian who wrote about the political illusion. And maybe the opposite of that is a political delusion. I don't know. It seems like there's multiple brands of it now in some really powerful ways. But, there's also the reality of kind of the book, The Way of the Modern World, Craig Gay talks about this kind of practical atheism. It's not that maybe you would mark on a survey, I'm an atheist, but the majority of people live as if God is largely irrelevant. And the relevance of God is at the core of whether you have a Christian worldview or not, whether there's someone higher to appeal to, someone to give thanks to, someone you're going to believe is concerned and interested in your life. And if you really don't think about God that way, even if you just primarily internalize him, that means you've kind of punted all your external relationships to some other power. And what other power is there? It's the state. And then the state has been overtaken by the process. And so there is a lot for us to learn. And there's so much on the ballot. You talked about levies. And we have 14 ballot initiatives in Colorado. Our ballot looks like
Yikes.
A book. And that's before all the judges and before all the races and all that. And I think 4 or 5 of them, I think there's 4 of them that are constitutional amendments. In other words, it's not just a ballot initiative with the effect of amending they're actually called amendments because that's what they're actually doing. That's a pretty, we're fiddling with some, and they're big things, right? The abortion, quote unquote, rights being super, super extreme. And the voting process, basically gutting the primaries, so that basically turning the state of Colorado into a mob rule democracy, at least in this way. This is, I'm proud of my girls. We were talking about this the other night. My daughter was like, America's not a democracy. It's a democratic republic. Plato warned about democracy. I'm like, you've been educated well, kid. I was proud of her.
Good for her. My 8-year-old told me from the back seat yesterday that, Mom, did you know in the future kids will be able to vote? And I said, do you mean in the sense that today's children will grow up and turn 18 and then vote? Or do you mean that children will be able to vote? And she said, no, children will be able to vote. And I said, I don't think that's good because kids don't know enough to vote. And she just said, I do. And that was like the end of the conversation. So there's that. But is your oldest, she's old enough to vote?
This is her first election. Yep. This is
cool. Okay. Very good. All right.
It's interesting. We spent some time going through that with her, and it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about political engagement and to bring your kids into the process and to talk about the things that are on the ballot. We tried to do that a lot throughout the years. And it's always funny when they've heard something and then they inform you of a political reality.
Right.
Which I've got some funny stories about that too. And it's like,
I love it.
Know that?
Did you?
I don't remember which race it was, but one of my daughters, when she was my middle daughter, when she was 6, I think, heard about the election and the seriousness of it. Maybe she was 8. She might have been a little older, but I was putting her to bed and just, she looked at me. She's like, Dad, this person, and whoever it was, the Democratic candidate, was like, he kills babies. And she said it just as serious and straight as that. And I said, well, let's talk through that. And, there are so many things I did not have on my bingo card for late night conversations. And the best piece of advice, I'm going to give you advice. I never give you parenting advice on this show, but I thought about it this week. I don't know why. We were with a group of people and it came up. The best parenting advice as dads of daughters, especially that I got, was from another dad of daughters, which is after 9:00, we don't have any serious conversations.
Yes, you told me this on the show last week.
Did I tell you this before?
Yeah, when we were talking about empathy, because we were talking about, I have thought about this all week. because you made a distinction that was so helpful between like validating people. It was so helpful, John. I'm complimenting you. It was
the most consequential breakpoint this week of our lifetime.
Of our lifetime. There's a distinction between validating a person's emotions, as in like, I see that you feel that way, but also being willing to tell your kids in particular when their emotions do not reflect reality. Like that emotion is actually wrong.
And after 9 p.m., it's almost always not a reflection
and it's
of reality.
always almost
nothing
always
good
wrong.
happens, right?
No kidding.
I mean, there's going to be exceptions to the rule. But kid, I understand. Sleep on it. We'll talk about it in the morning.
My daughter told me that if she becomes president, that her first thing that she'll do is make it so that drugs are illegal. And she's seen a lot of this in our neighborhood. And I said, I got something to tell you, babe. They're already illegal. And she was like, but they're not treating them like they're illegal. And I was like, well, yes, that is a conversation for another day.
The pre-political realities.
Here we go. John, I want to turn now to a piece in the New York Times, and then, of course, it's been picked up elsewhere as well, about a new study about the outcomes of prescribing puberty blockers to kids with gender dysphoria. And the study concluded that there is no discernible improvement in mental health outcomes for kids. And the study has not been published still. And it's essentially, I mean, when the New York Times is characterizing it as being either slow walked or suppressed, you know it's being slow walked or suppressed. And so the Times did a piece about it this week and interviewed the chief researcher and the doctor behind the study, who basically said the reason they haven't released the results yet is that they're afraid they'll be weaponized against their cause, which is one of the most sinister quotes I've ever heard in the area of medical research, but especially when you consider that this is involving children. And one of the other shocking parts of this story is that she says to the New York Times interviewer, who says, okay, you had a research study about, I think it's 500 some kids between 2015 and 2017. You monitored their outcomes. They came in 2015, you prescribed puberty blockers to suppress puberty and then monitored their outcomes. And you did not show any discernible improvement in mental health outcomes. And the doctor says, well, that's because when they first came into our clinic, they were in really good shape already. So they were already fine mentally, which begs about 10 questions. But thankfully, the reporter for the New York Times, which now I find myself motivated to go on a dig into this. It's like the sex and gender reporter for the Times. I want to go back and see how this person has characterized so-called transgender medicine in the past, because I can almost guarantee that they've used phrases like the widely accepted gender affirming model that we all know and research has said for decades is the best course of action and will dramatically reduce suicides and all this kind of stuff. I guarantee they've said that. Now that the studies are starting to come out that debunk that, they're going to pretend that they never said that and that they were just following what they were told to say before. Anyway, I'm going down a rabbit trail, but the reporter did push back and say, but in the study itself, you suggest that the kids who came in 2015 that you were about to start on puberty blockers had suicidal ideation, were reporting depression, were reporting anxiety, which is why presumably you went this course. And the doctor says, well, I'm just talking about an aggregate. They were fine in aggregate. I mean, it's just all, it's obfuscation at the highest levels. But I wanted to talk about this with you in particular this week too, because do you think this issue is gonna factor into the election? Not just this study, but the issue in general.
You know, I was just thinking the first program we had of 2024 talked about how this year felt different on this particular issue. It's something we've talked about a number of times. I've talked about on my weekly world segment that the beginning of 2023, with a number of thought leaders, Christian and non-Christian, who were really concerned about this, all felt like it was a runaway train. And it felt like it was going to oversweep everything. We were kind of losing all the conversational battles. We certainly didn't have any media personalities, even some conservative ones on our side. And to say that it all feels different right now is I think everyone has kind of sensed it and felt different at the beginning of 2024. It even feels more different now. And I'll tell you why. This is not the first story like this year. This was a big one. Maybe not as big as the Cash Review, which launched 2024. But my goodness, this is the New York Times saying, essentially, here are the facts. This lead researcher who did this study, and this isn't a new study. This study's been around, right? I mean, this is, how old is this? It's several years old. I don't remember
2015 to 2017 is when they were observing the participants.
Right when the science is settled rhetoric was starting to hit fever pitch. And you realize this is the New York Times basically doing a whistleblowing thing. And that's enormous. I think too about Megyn Kelly. Megyn Kelly is one of those who sat this out early on and even just kind of said, well, of course, and she kind of did a little both sidesism. On Bill Maher's show last week, I saw this segment. She was just flat out calling it the most significant issue of our day right now. And Bill Maher was agreeing with her. And together they were challenging the skeptical audience members who booed her. It was a remarkable exchange to see this.
She said on Barry Weiss's podcast last week that she's basically a single issue voter at this point, and this is her issue.
She said that on Bill Maher's show. And, first of all, she has a sizable audience, but secondly, she is doing this fearlessly in front of, in front of these audiences that aren't favorable. That's a huge thing. And she said she thought it would factor into this election. And, if you look at, I don't spend my time watching a lot of political debates. I thought there was a real missed opportunity from the president and the vice presidential candidates. This issue really didn't come up in these debates. And I think so at that level, it doesn't seem to be big in the election. But you know what? It came up in a whole lot of Senate races. I just saw a couple clips of Josh Hawley's debate. It came up front and center there. It came up for Ted Cruz in Texas. And it's come up in other places as well, where if you have candidates whose record includes, paying for transitions of incarcerated, or if you have folks who are really pushing it in schools and the ideology in schools and the protections and the women's sports and the women's locker rooms issues, then I think it's moved the needle. So I think it's something that's come up, and it's kind of counterbalanced abortion and abortion issues in those states. So I think it's huge. And let me just say quickly, it's not only that the New York Times said it, it's what the New York Times is willing to tell us. Every once in a while, you get the quiet part said out loud, and you get people who are so ideologically driven. They think it redefines all of reality, including what they're responsible for, and specifically that their own kind of line of work. This is a scientist. To excuse not releasing results because the other side might use those results is to thoroughly admit that you're not a real scientist, that you actually don't believe in science the way it's always been done, that you think that science itself should be weaponized for your cause and not for the other cause. Like, you're admitting this out loud. This is what it's saying. You're not saying we should follow where the data leads. You're saying the data should go where we lead. We have seen all kinds of examples of things not nearly as consequential for individuals, but where scientists fudge their results, where papers that are published can, reporting on certain studies cannot be replicated, which is the kind of second premise of science after observation. And the scientific method is to repeat it and get confirmed results. It is notable. And when you throw this into kind of the science is settled stuff about vaccines and about COVID and about all kinds of other things, it has contributed significantly to one of the pre-political realities that we're going to have to talk about for a long time, and that is the breakdown of trust. Look, everyone's skeptical of their political leaders. Look, a lot of people have been skeptical of press for a long time, but there are some that are supposed to be, trusted, your doctors, your priest and your pastors. Those are the ones you can really trust. Those are groups that are in a trust crisis as well. And the medical profession probably was the last one to go, and it's connected to scientific medical research and the fudging of that. This is an erosion that we are going to have consequences for. Trust is a inherent component in a society where you have order. Without trust, you don't get order. Just like without virtue, you don't get freedom. Kind of you talk about trusting elected officials, trusting police, trusting all these people that are supposed to be trusted. And you look around, you say, is there a trusted profession? Is there a trusted presence? Is there any left? I can't think of one. Can you? I mean, I really trust the guy who blew out our sprinklers this year, in preparation for winter this week. But, that's not I've used him, I like him. I would recommend him. But that's not like a consequential trust position. I'm just trying to think, are there any trusted?
So I think there are professions where we're forced to at least act as if we trust them because our daily lives won't work. Implicitly, you trust that the people who service your traffic lights, for example. I mean, it would be utter chaos if there weren't a handful of. And I don't think it's inconsequential that you trust your landscaper or whoever did that. I'm having our bathroom renovated right now, and I know next to nothing about construction. And obviously, I have to trust that he knows how to do plumbing and electrical so that I don't electrocute myself and, that I have a functioning bathroom. But what's interesting about that for the purposes of this discussion is that we've decided to trust this guy based on things that have nothing to do with construction. So we brought over a couple contractors to ask for estimates, and some of these guys didn't show up on time when they said they'd come to give the estimate. One of them asked for money up front before even, starting or buying the supplies. And like, those are the types of things that get to my larger point, which is the trust factor relies on character. There has to be something about a person's character or stated principles above and beyond just the practical nature of what they do. And that is what I think is lacking in, the bigger institutions that we're losing trust in. I mean, at the end of this New York Times story about this puberty blocking study, I just want to read this really quick. Dr. Olson Kennedy, that's the chief researcher and the doctor in this study. She noted that doctors' clinical experience was often undervalued in discussions of research. She has prescribed puberty blockers and hormonal treatments to transgender children and adolescents for 17 years, she said, and she's observed how profoundly beneficial they can be. That is this story version of someone saying, I have a Black friend. This is her saying, well, I've seen it work. And because I saw it work and I've decided that I know that it worked, then all this research and the scientific method that you put to this data is completely irrelevant because of my individual experience.
But that's not science. It's like that commercial. Remember that commercial with the old ladies where they're like, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
That's not how this works. Yes.
I mean, that's not how
not how any
physician works.
What do you think we're asking you to do when you do research? What do you think is happening right now? And the last thing I want to say about that study, which also speaks to the trust in institutions, is that it was always reasonable and rational to assume that suppressing puberty for a mental health issue was not going to help the mental health issue and was in fact going to worsen it. It was always the rational position to believe that boys can't be girls and girls can't be boys. I will stake my reputation on the prediction that what's going to happen in the media especially, but also in the healthcare industry, is that people are going to start to say they didn't know. That they were just following the research at the time. They read the Dutch protocol. They made the best decision they could with the information they had. And it's going to be important in order to maintain trust in institutions and to maintain trust in ourselves and each other, to not back down from the fact that there's no plausible deniability here. It was never reasonable to think that this stuff was going to work.
Yeah. And I wanted to address that too, because I get the anger and feel the anger behind that, and the need for kind of moral clarity on this, to not let people deny things that were obviously said and obviously written. But I've always been struck by that. We talked about this years ago. There was a British doctor who was opposed to this from the beginning and said, one of the challenges we have is that parents who have gone on and encouraged this and believe the advice of their physicians, it's going to be really hard for them to admit that they were wrong because they've just allowed the worst thing ever to happen to their own kid, other than maybe, taking the life of their child. We're going to have to find ways to create space for them to backtrack and to acknowledge that they were mistaken. And that's going to be really, really hard. And I look at this New York Times reporter, and I didn't go and dig deep into the archives, but it's the same thing with Megyn Kelly. It's the same thing with Barry Weiss. It's the same thing with a whole lot of people. We do live in a cultural moment where saying I'm wrong and please forgive me, there's no space for that, right? In a critical theory mood culture, we don't have paths of redemption. You're guilty because of who you are, not because of what you've done. And saying I was wrong for what I've done doesn't mean you're ever forgiven. And that has affected the Christian world as well, where, you're guilty once, you're guilty forever. And sometimes, obviously I'm not kind of at any level trying to, justify the removal of consequences for behavior or the necessity of saying I was wrong, right? And not just kind of reframing, as you said, the words that I said in the past, I really meant this, and then getting me off the hook. I'm not saying any of that. It's going to be really important to acknowledge that they're wrong, but there are going to be people who are doing it differently, who said, I may have once said this, but I realized that that's not where the data leads. And we have to figure out ways, I think, across the board to restore trust, to have forgiveness, and to have paths of redemption and restoration. All of this, by the way, frames out something that's really important, which is in an age where there's a crisis of trust, Christians have an incredible opportunity to be trustworthy. In an age where there are no means of personal forgiveness and redemption, Christians have that, and Christians can offer that. And when there is no kind of reconciliation to even entire segments of society or entire vocations and professions, Christians can build those bridges. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that if we actually want to move people forward. I was listening to a podcast this morning, and I think the speaker was he was talking about it was Ross Douthat, the kind of the sole conservative still, at the New York Times. And he's such a thoughtful guy. And he was talking about, one of the things we'll see, to go back to our first segment, is whether this will be a consequential election or not. I think it is, in kind of a more apocalyptic way. But he's also, he brought up, we'll look back and say, is this the time where there was a shift, towards a kind of more unified people gave up on some of these ideas that didn't work in the past. And you can notably say that 2024 was a shift on this issue. This election could play that role and could result in the abandonment. Like, look, I think there are Democratic politicians who are personally vested in this issue, like this doctor that was quoted and studied in the New York Times. But I think a lot of people are just like, it's a winning issue. And if it stops being a winning issue, they jump ship. Well, I mean, we've seen that from the right on abortion. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And then how are we going to go forward? So we have to think about paths of reconciliation. Again, I don't think it involves ever allowing someone to bury the receipts, right? To claim that they didn't say something that they didn't say, especially if their position was one of consequence. Admitting, I did this out of what I thought was empathy, what I thought was compassion. I did this because I believed, these people who said that the science was settled and I shouldn't have. And look, I don't think that gets them off the hook just because there was this kind of narrative that, went unchallenged for so long and it seemed so, so powerful. Because look, what you're doing is socially experimenting and scientifically and medically experimenting on children. Like, you never do that. You never ever do that.
The stakes do not get higher than that. You just can't.
It doesn't. And we're going to have to admit that. Like, this was an ideology that led to the social and scientific and medical experimentation on children without evidence. And in the face of things that should have been pretty obvious, like, puberty is a real biological thing and biological things are real things. The leap of faith that this woman is asking us to make, like, I've seen it work and I know. And I mean, she's actually asking, trust me. I have seen gravity not, mean going up instead of going down.
All the people this worked for, like, just didn't have the luck to be included in this study. You'll just have to trust me. They're over here somewhere.
Yeah. But in terms of the process, like the accepted norms that we've abandoned, that's a segment you and I should do at some point. Like, you don't experiment on children because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put the stuff back in the box. You don't experiment on children, especially with things that might have such significant long-term consequences. And I mean, this was what blew me away the other day when I watched the Megyn Kelly clip. She didn't pull any punches. She was like, this is what they did. And this is what it means for a whole group of children who were told this was going to help.
Yeah, that's my point.
Promise, I'm done.
Is like, it wasn't, there was never a logical basis for it wasn't just an ideology. It was an irrational, it was a delusion. There was no,
it was an irrational ideology.
Like, reasonable. Yeah. And so my husband told me once several years ago that when you're in an argument with somebody, you always have to, even if you are just staunchly convinced that you're 100% right, which in every argument that I'm in, I am 100% right. So that goes without saying. But when you're in an argument with somebody, you have to give them a way to maintain their own dignity. Like, you can't, when you embarrass people in a public conversation or private conversation, or that's what you're seeking to do, or you leave no opening for them to save face, even if it doesn't really make sense, you're just going to lose people. Like, that's just a cruelty that's unnecessary. And I think on an individual level, you're exactly right, especially when it comes to parents or children themselves who went through this and asked for it, that we have to be as soft-hearted as we can possibly be. And the church especially, should be a place of healing and openness and acceptance for people who have gone through this or perpetrated it on their kids. All of that is correct. But just like with other, losses of trust institutionally, where it's important to hold people to account is when they're in some sort of authority, and we have to decide whether to reinstate that authority to them. So I think if you've set yourself up as a reporter and you've gone along with this for the past 10 years, probably you're disqualified from being a reporter. You're certainly disqualified from being a reporter that I trust, or that I probably will ever trust again. And that's reasonable. That's not an individual level thing. I mean, just because of how rational it was, it's not the same as like a medication or a vaccine or whatever, where it's like, okay, reasonable people could have come to reasonable, rational conclusions at the beginning, and then we waited for more data, all of that. This is not one of those things.
I think it's different if somebody somebody saying, well, I didn't really ever say that, or, excuse themselves. But someone who legitimately says I was wrong, I tend to trust that person, and I was wrong, and I see now, and here's what I see. I tend to trust that person more. There is an acknowledgement that I think we need to create space for, and it is the gospel. Now, I'm not talking about an easy grace or an easy believism or get out of jail free card. And I'm especially here thinking about parents caught in this situation, because first of all, the social contagion aspect of this, and the sheer mass that just overwhelmed. And here you have a bunch of parents who a lot of times didn't get help from their churches, didn't get help from the people that should have helped them. Got a bunch of people that were staying quiet. We're dealing with a set of comorbidities that had serious consequences of suicidality and depression and, other, mental health conditions. I just heard from one not too long ago who listens to our program, and we were talking about a very specific part of this issue, maybe a specific report like this, and here's the data, and her response was understandable, which is, she's in this situation with someone she loves, and she said essentially, but what do I do? Okay, what do I do? And 3-4 years into this thing that seems never ending, what do I do? And there's so many people caught in that right now, which goes to, I think one of the things we talked about last week was the study from, was it Barna or 80% of church members say that they want their pastors to talk about these things.
It was Lifeway.
Lifeway, right. And, I feel like there's a whole lot of people, and this is what we mean when we say ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. And the social contagion aspect of this gave us sheer numbers. And every one of those sheer numbers is an individual who loves somebody. It reflects individuals who love somebody and want to help them when things seem really, really confusing. And, we oftentimes talk to moms and dads of young children. I'm like, here's everything you can do to get ahead of it. But there's some that aren't ahead of it and they're in the middle of it. And, not my empathy, my compassion, my sadness for those caught in the middle of that was kind of heightened again.
I think that's why I feel so angry about reporters and doctors who've manipulated or withheld or, gone along with the delusion, because at the other end of their malpractice is parents and kids who are suffering and have suffered because of it.
Yeah. Everything we do in the Colson Center, we want to come back and say, what's the gospel demand of us? And the shortcuts that we take to the gospel for politics are well documented, right? And not always accurately documented, but well documented. And we always have to think about that. I always think about there's that wonderful beginning to The Silver Chair, one of the Narnia books, where Jill Pole thinks that Eustace has fallen over the cliff and died, and it's her fault because she was the way she had treated him. And so she's sitting under the tree and crying about her loss. And Lewis says something really profound. He goes, crying is good while it lasts, but you got to stop sometime and you still got to decide what to do next. And I've thought about that a lot during the season, because there's so many things that can motivate us and motivate our response. And outrage is one of them. Chuck Colson used to say outrage is not a strategy. And outrage is completely justified a whole lot of times. But there's still how do I have a gospel response here? One that's shaped by the kingdom, one that's shaped by Christian worldview. And we got to put things in place. And that's one of the punchlines of our, that we have to get to, is that we're a culture of exhausted resources. Like, we tried everything that we tried, from trusting this establishment to trusting that process to trusting this person in power. And we're looking around and the resources are depleted. And, we're a culture that oftentimes acts and votes and spends and relates by what we're against, not what we're for. Like, there's not a positive vision of life in the world that we actually are living by. We're kind of playing defense all the time. And that's a exhausting way to live. And the church has some resources here that could breathe new life into a society. I spent a lot of time with the great Os Guinness recently, and his conversation is, we're in decline. What do you do when you're in decline? Historically, it's either it's either the death of a civilization or the renewal of a civilization. Those are the two options. Sometimes the death is violent and quick and revolutionary, and sometimes the renewal is revolutionary. But the renewal comes, because of other pre-political, pre-government, pre-revolutionary realities. And So, and speaking of which, that'll be my recommendation, is our Lighthouse Voices conversation that we're going to have with Oz the week after the election. So sneak preview.
Ooh, awesome. Awesome. John, I want to just talk quickly about an incredibly tragic story that I heard you discussing a little bit today on The World and Everything in It on the Culture Friday segment, which I thought was really helpful. But there was a 14-year-old boy in Florida who committed suicide recently, and his mom is suing an AI chatbot company, the company behind the chatbot, because this young boy basically developed an infatuation with an AI chatbot character. And this company puts forward this software as if it's like a digital companion kind of thing. This boy, the boy's mom, who is a lawyer, says that, he knew that it wasn't a real person. And this was a character that was kind of loosely based on a character from the Game of Thrones or something. But it's essentially a software that can chat back to you. You say things to it, and then it repeats human-ish phrases back to you. And he developed this infatuation, this emotional entanglement with this software and ultimately took his own life because of it. I mean, I think they said, the investigator said one of the last things he said on this chat service was something like, "I'm coming to be with you," or something. So it was obviously directly related to this. I'm fascinated by the legal questions here. I think this is clearly uncharted territory in that regard. But I'm also really fascinated and horribly sad about these questions around, even if we know something is not real, is not another person, that relationship, like what we view as a relationship, can still hold such sway over us, which I think speaks to the power of relationships and our need for them. But the first question I want to ask you in relation to this story is there ever a healthy way to engage something like a chatbot software? I'm trying to imagine a defense where they say, well, we created this software for this good purpose, and here it got warped. But I can't imagine what the good purpose even would be.
Yeah, no, I think there is. I think there's going to be like quicker diagnoses of medical conditions, right? That AI.
I don't mean AI generally. I mean these like companionship things.
Oh, in that case, I think the answer is, maybe, but it reflects something else that's more deeply broken. So, as in terms of a kind of an emergency way of providing companionship and care to those who are infirmed or those who are isolated and lonely. But the reason that they're isolated and lonely, by and large, at the mass that we would need these sorts of artificial companions, is because of the declining birth rate around the world. It's because, we now are in the third and fourth generation of not having enough children. And if you don't have children, you don't have caretakers later in life. This is the kind of math reality that we're facing around the Western world. And so we're going to look for digital replacements. So those digital replacements could play a positive role, but it's basically putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound that's going to be far more destructive, in the long run. But I want to go back to something else, which is, I don't understand the comment, he knew it wasn't reality, when he made a decision of such consequence in reality. That's just not true. He clearly believed it was reality. Or more accurately, well, I don't know accurately because I don't want to speak to this, but the other theory here is that this was a young man who lost touch with real reality. You know what I mean? There's two ways to lose touch with reality. One is to call something real that's not, your imaginary, friend. There was just a movie about that, I guess. The other is to think the real world is not the real world, right? Right? You can lose touch with reality in a Matrix way, or what was that movie? Is it If or something like that? My kids were talking about it. A bunch of imaginary friends.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about A Beautiful Mind.
Okay, that's way more sophisticated. So my point is,
love that movie.
I thought I was pretty impressive to combine, an analysis culturally of the two movies I chose, and you had to throw in another series. Beautiful Mind. Fine.
I'm very sophisticated, John. You got to.
But Daniel Borstein back in 1961, who's a social critic, said, "We are the first generation in history to have made our illusions so vivid and so realistic that we actually live in them." That's 1961, kids. I mean, that's he's just talking about television. He's just talking about, soap opera dramas at that time and other plays. Yeah. This was I remember coming across that quote in a book called Life, the Movie, in which the take was that we kind of think about life through the movies. When you have created structures of such a disembodied reality, then you believe that reality is, in fact, disembodied. You're never outside of that. But clearly he believed this was reality because he made these consequential decisions. And I've heard some comments, as much as I appreciate the work of Jonathan Haidt and his, take on social media and smartphones and the mental health crisis and that sort of stuff. It's clear that those devices that we have made ubiquitous have worsened the whole situation. No question. But the critics are saying, look, the crisis that we're seeing in meaninglessness and purposelessness can't be fully explained by that. It is a necessary comorbidity of the larger problem, but there's a larger problem here. And this is one of them. Like, the AI chatbot doesn't lead a child all the way down the rabbit hole unless his real reality, his family, his community, and so on. If those realities hadn't been overtaken by it, we think that there should be legal consequences for parents who enable the fantasies of school shooters. This is a hard one for me. Parents
really
are
hard.
the first group of people that can legitimately and should care for children and keep them out of these vortexes of delusion. This is how do you get this far down the rabbit hole? That's a question that we have to ask.
When I was doing research for the chapter that I wrote for Pro-Child Politics with Katy, Faust, and I was looking at digital technology, I was reading about this uptick in a psychological diagnosis, especially among young men, where they called it psychological derealization, where if you play video games for long enough and you get immersed enough in this, people will start to literally lose touch with when they're playing the game and when they're not. So, they'll see people do incredibly violent or illogical things in the real world because they actually literally think that they're still in the game. And I could see that playing a factor here where I know, he obviously made the most consequential action, you can do by taking his life. But I could also envision if you've lost touch with reality in one area, that decision not even feeling that real at the moment. I don't know what the diagnosis is here, but
part of the adolescent neurological development process is actions and consequences, right? So when you talk about the adolescent brain, there is a part of the brain that is still developing during adolescence that connect cause and effect, action and consequence. Now, throughout most of the history of the world, there was no stage of life called adolescence because you went from being a child to being an adult and you went through some sort of rite of passage. And even though some of these young adults behave like what we would now call adolescents, you expected them to behave like adults, right? And one of the big ways you behave like an adult is thinking that your actions actually have consequences. And that very factor of expectation made the connections, right? That's how kids grew up and grew up faster. So now we have the cult of adolescence, which didn't always exist. I remember the book, The Death of the Grown-Up, great book, begins with this line: there was a time literally when there were no teenagers. And the point is that throughout most of history, we didn't talk about teenagers being a teenage thing. So we put now young people in this stage of life called adolescence, and then we put them in these virtual realities that undermine consequence, right? That don't always have high expectations of them, in which they can't actually judge. And yeah, I would say this is an adolescent brain caught in a fantasy world, making an incredible decision. And yeah, I think it's very likely that there was not a real sense of, oh, if I do this, this is what's going to happen to me, right? Because the connections aren't made. But we're a society that doesn't make connections anymore. That's the deeper problem.
Agreed. This morning, maybe we'll have time to talk about this next week. Just literally an hour ago when I was driving here, the BBC was airing a story about a psychologist in the UK who is studying taking patients with psychosis and specifically schizophrenia who hear voices and using AI to make their voices have an actual voice. So they can plug in what they hear their voices saying and then hear it back from. And she said this has a way of sort of validating that they're feeling this way. We don't want to just come up to them and say none of that's real because of course they're hearing it. So it's real to them. But then this is a way that will help them have more control over it. I did not understand her argument, but I got the worst sense of foreboding that, if this is the path we're on, where we're going to, again, we're losing touch with reality because of what our technology makes us think we can do. And if it's like, well, so you're living with voices that are not real, but you feel like they're real. How could we make them real for you? That is losing touch with reality 101, and that cannot lead to a good place.
Well, when you begin, as Carl Truman said, in The Cult of the Self, right? That's the logical therapy, is to validate one's own experiences, not to, as we talked about sometimes say, I understand you're feeling that way, but you're wrong. You could make them real in order for them to tell the people that they're not real. In other words, maybe
that
you could front load this.
I know. I didn't like the way she was talking about it.
It's so weird.
Something about the way she was talking about it made me think that that's not the direction she was going to go in. But yeah, I mean, that's like a core. Well. I don't like this. That's a core tenet of cognitive behavioral therapy is like, yes, I understand you feel this way or you had that thought, but here's what's actually real.
Yeah,
and
here's what's true.
If you can't say what's actually real, then we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, John, let's move to recommendations real quick. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the Lighthouse Voices with Os Guinness?
Yeah. Look, I think it is an incredibly consequential election. And one of the most important things is what's going to come out of it. How are we going to recalibrate? It's the most important outcome of this election won't be what happens in the White House, but what happens in your house and in your house of worship. And we know all this. Kind of sounds trite and redundant, but we do really need to think along these lines. And so 2 things coming up maybe that could be helpful. The first is the day after the election, I'll be at Liberty University with the new president, their newer president, has been there for a couple of years, is a good friend and colleague, Colson fellow, Don DeCostin. And he asked me to come in and speak at what's called Convo, which is the chapel service of Liberty University the day after the election. And I was like, well, it's very likely we will not know anything about what happened or we will not have the results. And the reply was, and that's all the more reason, because what we need to do is really establish the ground outside of that. So Convo is broadcast online, so that's something that you can catch if you're interested. And then basically a week later, on the 12th of November, Tuesday, begins at 7 p.m. Local time here in Colorado Springs. If you are in the area, you can join us at the Welcome Center at Focus on the Family. If you're not, you can catch this again on the live stream. The place to register is colsoncenter.org/lighthouse. But our final Lighthouse Voices event of the year with the one and only Os Guinness. Os has been, I think, helping us more than anyone else take us to kind of a 40,000 foot level in terms of that. You are here. Where are we? And doing that a week after the election, whether we know results by then or whether we don't know results, whether things are settled or whether it's not settled, whether there's contesting the results or not contesting the results, whether it's been a landslide here or not a landslide there, to actually get our minds around the kind of people we need to be. In my mind, this is going to be a important conversation in the overall pushback on some of the forces that are shaping life together, particularly the forces of the sexual revolution, which is his topic that night. And then what kind of people can we be in order to do that? So I think that both of these are ways to kind of think beyond the election without trivializing this very, very consequential thing that is going to take place in our nation. So yeah, it's kind of a pair of recommendations, but you do that every single week. So I thought that I don't know what you're talking about. One double recommendation.
I had 3 things to recommend this week, and then I was like, Maria, you can't overplay your hand. You just got to narrow it down to one. So I am going to recommend a book. So Veterans Day is coming up on November 11th. And yesterday I interviewed somebody who was fascinating. His name is Joshua Haller. He's a pastor in St. Louis. He's also a combat veteran. And he wrote a book called Redeeming Warriors: Veteran Suicide, Grieving, and the Fight for Faith. And in the book, he talks about how I think 9 members of his battalion, since he served in the Iraq War, have since taken their lives. And his really, really fascinating perspective is that, and I'm going to read from a blurb of the book here. He argues that veteran suicide is not primarily a problem born out of exposure to combat and PTSD, but out of a broken relationship between people and God. And so we got to talk about that yesterday kind of at length. And obviously PTSD and combat play a huge role in this issue, but this is a growing issue. The suicide rate among veterans is much higher than the general population. And so this is, as always, an opportunity for the church. But I think a critical part of the church's ministry in this area will be understanding the problem. And this pastor, Josh Haller, is really driving the message home that this is primarily an issue of community and discipleship and, relationship with God and with others, more so than it is, a unsolvable psychological problem, basically, if that makes sense. So he was incredible to talk to. And I have a story that'll be coming out around Veterans Day in Christianity Today, sort of about some of these issues. So I will share that when it's live too. But for now, please do check out Pastor Josh Haller's book, Redeeming Warriors. So that is my recommendation. Okay. I'm going to save my other two for next week because I'm going to be good. That's going to be it for the show today, John. Thank you so much for joining us for Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Bear, alongside John Stonestreet, reminding you to please leave us a rating and a review if you haven't already. That just helps us get in front of even more people. And you can find links to the stories we talked about today, as well as other commentaries and resources at breakpoint.org. Have a great week. We'll see you all back here next week.